You see that, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, good evening. It's a pleasure speaking to you guys in Windhoek or wherever else you are. I have fond memories of Namibia. I was actually there when probably some of you were not yet born. 25 years ago, I was backpacking through your beautiful country, and I still have some very, very vivid memories of the beauty of the country. Especially, I remember when I was there, Sossusvlei had just been filled up by a massive rainstorm, and people were trekking down from Windhoek, and we were ending up swimming in the desert. I don't know whether that's now these days a more common thing with climate change, or whether that's something that's still special. Anyway, yeah, today I'm going to take you through some of our work. I'm going to take you on a small journey through Uganda. You will see that our projects are quite sort of spread out over the country, and but I will always show you roughly where we are at the time. But before I do that, let me just quickly introduce to you Localworks. This is the team that you see there. We are, as you've explained in your intro, we have we are sort of a mixed bunch. These are not all architects that you see there. We are a mix of architects and engineers and landscape designers, quantity surveyors, and also craftsmen, because we have started building ourselves. What you see there on the lower pictures is our office. You also see that in my background. And the way we have set up our office is really in a way that we're trying to encourage multidisciplinary working as much as we can, and we're trying to collaborate as much as possible. What's also really important is the workshop area that we have there. You see that in the bottom right corner, with the idea that architects are shouldn't only be guys working behind the screen. They should also really get involved in model making, in one-to-one samples, in materials testing. And we believe that the more that is the case, the more with time you can really ensure that you design really buildable and practical buildings. This is where Uganda is, for those of you who are not 100% sure. I'm sure you all know where Namibia is. You can get an idea of the size comparison. It's probably, I guess, about a third or so in size, and it's completely different in terms of its landscape. You will see that in some of the photos later on. Of course, Uganda being right on the equator is a properly tropical climate, but a very, very comfortable climate given its relative altitude. This number, 40%, is a staggering figure. It's an estimate by the UN, and it explains, or it describes, to what extent the construction industry, the global construction industry, is responsible for carbon emissions and eventually for the climate change. For us as architects, that's a huge number. We are right at the heart of the construction sector, and I think it really puts it emphasizes to what extent architects could actually make a difference when it comes to improving the way humans deal with their environment. Certainly for us as Localworks, this is a real motivating factor, or a real driver of our work. The whole idea of finding ways of building more environmentally friendly is certainly something that is at the heart of our work. We try to see the whole issue of green architecture very much as a in a non-fundamentalist way. We want to be quite pragmatic and practical about it, but we do not want to lose our we don't want to lose sight of why we really do it. Pragmatic meaning that whenever we can, we deploy low tech. We deploy very simple, fundamentally simple principles. If you want to achieve a comfortable indoor climate for a building, I believe it is more sensible to make sure you orientate it correctly to the sun and to the wind. You shade it on the outside adequately. you ensure there's cross ventilation, you use the right materials, especially for the roof. So these are all very, very simple and practical approaches that do lead to more environmentally friendly buildings without deploying real high tech, without deploying mechanical means, etc. So that is really something that is a driver in our work. The first place I'm going to take you to is in the northeastern corner of Uganda. There's a wonderful, beautiful region called Karamoja, and we've been working there in 2 villages, one called Garimage and one called Sarachom. The projects are called Kidapo primary schools. Kidapo Valley National Park is there. You see that in brown is a fairly large national park right at the border of South Sudan. It's of all the national parks that we have, it's the furthest from Kampala, from Entebbe, where the international airport is, and therefore it has the least visitors. To a certain extent, you can say it's the most beautiful one, and of course, because of its remoteness, it's a wonderful place to visit if you want to see wildlife. What is shown there in yellow is an area, is a corridor that the animals, especially the elephants, use regularly during the dry season on their lookout for water. They then end up in that what is called community wildlife area in the south. And of course, as they trek up and down, there's always lots and lots of conflict with the local population. And this is really where our project started from. Our client there was the African Wildlife Foundation, and they had been engaged with the local community in drawing up what is called a land use plan. And that is really all about trying to vacate the corridor, and in order to do so, it is about really trying to create certain incentives for the locals to do that. And building schools was one part of a bigger number of measures, and this is where we were brought in. So we had 2 sites. You see them there with the blue dots. This is Kidapo National Park. It has a really fabulous landscape. It has got this beautiful savanna grasslands that keep changing in color from yellow to green, and you've then got these mountain ranges on the eastern and western side. Lots of kopjes, and then this beautiful granite stone that sort of oscillates between gray tones and these rusty brown tones. The typical house up there is built with its wooden roof structure essentially exposed. So they actually build their roofs first, and then they build the brick or mud brick walls within. This is quite an interesting way of working. It certainly allows for the wooden poles to be replaced very easily. You can literally just raise up the roof, hold it up, and slide another pole under when termites have affected it. This is sort of the typical manyatta, as they call it up there. And part of our sort of initial design process is always to engage with all stakeholders. We did this on site, and this was not only one session. These were a number of sessions that we held, because of course, especially when you work with an international funding agency, it's really, really important that you, as the architect, step in to make sure that certain expectations that the end users will have, and certain expectations that the donor has, somehow are well aligned and are well moderated, and misunderstandings are being avoided. So we approach these 2 sites in 2 very different ways. They are really located in totally different landscapes. The first site on the left there is called Garimage, and it is actually located right at the edge of the national park, within the lowlands, within the savanna. And here, really, the landscape approach was to sort of play with the shapes that we found all those local compounds to be organized as. And then for Sarachom, for the other side, we wanted to turn that more into what we call the farm school. This is really now located in the middle of a village, or right next to a village. and lots of subsistence farming around it. And we felt that really on a landscape level, it would be nice to express that in a much more orthogonal and terraced sort of arrangement. The buildings are actually the same. There was no scope for designing different buildings. And we really developed a simple design for this project that was very much inspired by the materials that we found when we did our initial research, and by this idea of expressing the structure on the outside. I think you can see there's a certain quote there from the building that I showed you at the beginning, and you can also see our idea of using that grey granite stone in a dry stack, in a natural dry stack, up to window sill level, and then from then onwards we decided to use compressed earth blocks because we found that the earth that was available on both sides was very suitable to that. We always try to start really at foundation level already with considering what does it really mean to build, environmentally friendly. And of course, a rubble stone foundation, as it's shown here on in these images, is a very, very sustainable form of foundation. It's something that was done for thousands of years and kind of got forgotten with the discovery of cement. These are very simple and very efficient foundations. They work not in all soil conditions and not for all buildings, but certainly for our relatively small single-story buildings, this is quite an ideal material for the foundations. We actually use this as a real income-generating activity for the locals. We essentially bought the stone off them. We asked them to collect for us stone, and then the contractor really picked it up from people's gardens and farms, so that they really also had a source of income through this project. And then the walls above it, as I said, we opted for compressed earth blocks, manually pressed on site. This is of course a wonderfully sustainable way of working. You use pretty much 93% or so of the material that comes directly from the site. Normally a mix of the earth that you excavate and maybe sand that you mix into it, and then there is a small amount of cement as stabilizer utilized here. The blocks that come out of this are really very, very regular and tidy, and therefore allow to do quite a bit of decent bonding and decent masonry, really. And what is also interesting about these blocks is that when they are still fresh, you can actually cut them. So what you see there in the top right corner are blocks that we have then turned into channels effectively, and we then use these to conceal our ring beam in a double level arrangement. For the roof, for this particular project, we opted for steel as our main structural material. That really had to do with the fact that there's absolutely no timber really available up there. There are no plantations whatsoever. Huge pressure on the available trees. So we felt that steel was the right answer. But we then, when we do this and when we opt for such a material, we then really try to minimize its use as much as possible. So these trusses are actually made more or less using window profiles, little angles, little hollow sections welded together. And as you can see there, a 7-meter truss is so light that 2 guys can easily lift it up and still smile while they're doing so. And we actually managed to fit the entire roof structure for 2 schools on a single truck, which was also fantastic given that Kampala is quite far away from the site. The other really important aspect when you work in such areas is, of course, that you want to conserve trees and shrubs. This is all a very sensitive environment, and of course the client, coming from a conservation background, really wanted these schools to be what they call conservation schools. So protecting absolutely every single shrub and tree was at the heart of what we did, and we did a very detailed tree survey and then placed our buildings in such a way that cutting of trees was minimized. The Karamoja are very famous for their very colorful jewelry, and I think you can see that where our idea of these that color scheme sort of came from. these schools are designed in such a way that we kind of expect there to be almost zero maintenance. So we really wanted to come up with buildings that are as maintenance friendly as possible, and avoiding glass is one of the key requirements there. So that's why we opted for these large sliding screens that during good and hot weather can be opened fully. This photo really summarizes the material palette: stone, earth, steel, and nature. Given that the client wanted these schools to be really sort of teaching about the coexistence of wildlife and human development, it was very important for the classrooms to feel quite connected to the surrounding. Sorry. And thereby, this is really the reason why we opted for these relatively large and very, very low windows. They actually allow the kids to literally walk through them. And when the shutters are fully open, you don't see them, and it feels very, very external as a space. And then this is sort of, I would say, strengthened by the fact that we use the same materials on the inside and on the outside, and we don't actually finish these walls. The material stone, especially stone at a low level, but then also the fair-faced compressed earth is really suitable for that. It ages reasonably well, and in our experience, plastering and painting walls is really something that is not working in an upcountry setting. The other thing that we have done here, that we do a lot on our project, is playing with a bit of light from above. You see there a tiny strip of translucent sheet that is installed right above the blackboard to add a little bit of direct daylight into these rooms. And as one beautiful aspect of this, of working with earth, in my view, is that almost inevitably you end up sort of merging with the surrounding. You see here how the color of this copy in the background and the color of the building corresponds very beautifully. And equally simple ways of creating covered external spaces. The budget was very tight, so there was no room for a real kind of, assembly hall or dining hall. So all we could really do was creating some benches and then extending the roof out a little bit and at least partially covering the little amphitheater. We used the stone also for some of the hardscape elements, little benches, little curved elements that frame a certain beautiful tree, and very nearby here's the kitchen, and the kids can then sit on these little benches in the shade of the tree. We're now moving south towards eastern Uganda. There's a place called Kamuli. Excuse me. Kamuli is a town, but our site is outside of that town, right at the entrance. The project is called Pirigiti Rural Training Center. It was a project that was commissioned by Iowa State University, who have a program in Uganda where they work with students from their own university and students from Makerere University. This was the site we found. You can see that it's a very elongated site. It's about 10 acres. It is accessed from the top and then sort of stretches out towards the valley. It's not a very steep site, quite gently sloping by Ugandan standards. And then at the southernmost tip, it actually really ends up in a natural wetland. It was quite clear, given that the site was accessed from the top, that there was a certain functional arrangement that we wanted to follow. That was that all our services we wanted to deal with right away at the beginning. Then we wanted to focus on research and communal activities, accommodation, then agriculture and sports, and eventually forestry. You can also see on that left drawing that trees, there was quite a lot of existing trees there. They were all sort of focused more on the western boundary, and we actually later took the decision to use that area for our buildings, perhaps a bit unusually, and actually continue to use the rest of the open land for agricultural functions. This is now rotated, but you can see how the buildings are broken down into courtyards, and the courtyards are placed in the forest, whereas the rest of the site is more or less retained as farm area and sports stroke leisure. We broke up the functions into 3 main buildings. The first one is indeed for communal use, for research, etc. And then we have 2 further courtyard buildings, which are purely for accommodation. One is for the teachers, the smaller one, and one is for students. These are essentially visiting groups. They can stay there at times 2-3 months, sometimes maybe half a month, and they sleep in, they share sort of rooms, a bit like a dormitory sort of style. Always 4 people share one room. Very early on, we sort of developed this theme of these very strict rectangular footprints, within which we then we started playing with sort of non-parallel edges, which of course immediately automatically translates into relatively complicated roofs that slope in different directions. And we wanted to create this sort of landscape of roof, if you want, that that follows the soft contours of the site. And the second theme, or maybe actually the same theme that came along with that, was the idea that these rectangular footprints would really have a very, very strong skin on the outside, a very textured skin on the outside made out of fired brick. And then on the inside, we played more with sort of soft colors, painted plaster, wooden elements as well. Almost sort of a coconut that you cut open and you compare these sort of, yeah, you compare these two you create these very 2 different qualities. And really the theme everywhere was the threshold between the 2, the threshold between the very defined, courtyard theme versus the more soft and open and fluid landscape around it. One interesting thing is when you work on the equator is that you always struggle with a very vertical sun at midday. If you sort of use very smooth finishes, such as plaster, you will, no matter how high the quality is, no matter how well the plaster is applied, at 12 o'clock you can be sure that it looks terrible. It's just, the sun is just absolutely unforgiving because of its vertical angle. So one interesting, advantage of using such a textured facade is that that problem is definitely not really relevant anymore. And you can see that these are actually, these are full bricks that we use there, but in a composite arrangement. So we built 100 mil concrete block on the inside and then 100 mil solid brickwork. The big advantage that this presented was that we could actually erect all walls relatively quickly, and then we could take our time on the brickwork, which of course is quite complex to get the bonding right in sort of these patterns. But at least we could at the same time already work on the ring beam, on the roof structure, etc. That was a great help. And the 2 walls are really acting together as a composite using fish lights, which we inserted into the blockwork at the right level. This brick is, by the way, a fired brick, but what I would sort of call a sustainably fired brick. So we get these from brickworks that use coffee husk as a firing material rather than firewood. This is very important in a country where generally deforestation is a huge problem, and it is really caused by a combination of construction, especially the typical roadside kiln and cooking. So whenever we do use brick, we make sure that it is from a brickworks that utilizes coffee husk, which is really a natural byproduct of coffee production. Here again, the issue of, or the theme of the threshold that interested us in this particular project most. Little entrances that take you into the courtyards and sort of an outdoor living room as seen from the surrounding forest. Very rural roof shapes. We didn't want to create sort of something that is completely out of context, but at the same time the client was really keen on creating something that is at the same time also not a direct copy of it. We used brick and steel, again, sort of a lightweight steel. You see that the columns are kind of almost broken up into different angles. The client had very high expectations in terms of maintenance friendliness of the structure. So that's where really the idea came from, to utilize steel as a main material. Another theme that we wanted to really express in the design was the idea of rainwater harvesting. Rainwater is actually the primary water source in this project, and you can see there that we disconnected in a way the gutter from the roof. The roof is sort of jacked up. That really had two advantages. One, we wanted to ventilate the ceilings, and this gap, that the resulting gap of this jacking up business, was really our air inlet for the ventilated ceiling. And then number two, we kind of like the idea of expressing the gutter almost as a if you want, as a separate tray. And because it is so wide and so out of a reflective material, you actually realize that there's a certain sunlight reflection happening at certain times of the day that indirectly light up the walkway. That is something that we are always very interested in a tropical climate. How can you avoid this incredibly sharp change of light when you leave a room and you step out into the sunshine? The walkway can really produce a wonderful sort of transition zone there, and it's helpful to actually get a bit of additional light into such spaces. Here again, you see how the roof is jacked up and how we play with very, very skinny sort of roof edge details, and then the water is actually just spouting down and being picked up on the ground. This explains the idea of the ventilated ceiling. This is something that's incredibly important, of course, in hot climates, if you want to create a comfortable indoor climate. So here we have very reflective roof sheets, then we have a gap, and then we have in this particular case, we have a cement plaster ceiling below. And as long as you're very careful in netting this ventilation zone so that you don't end up having lots of birds and bats, etc., living up there, then this is creating very, very comfortable indoor climates with very, very good properties also during heavy rains. Some detail around the doors. These are so each of these doors now accesses one dormitory room for 4 students. Again, as a consequence of the idea that how can we make these rooms as transparent as possible, but at the same time get light in but not get direct sunlight in. And you see here that we have actually, in this particular case, connected a walkway roof against glass, which is a bit unusual and not so easy to detail. But the big advantage is that somehow you create this wonderful amount of indirect daylight inside the living room. And then a theme that we always like to play with, and we like to sort of, drive around and find certain precast elements that people sell by the roadside. I think you see what you see, what you see there in the background. Those are the typical precast concrete vent blocks that people use in warehouses, sort of as high-level vents. But here for some reading window, we turned them 90 degrees and we inverted them, and thereby it creates this rather interesting indirect light effect in a complete private arrangement for this little reading window. And then the same theme that you saw with the complicated roofs, then used once as a very, very simple one, a little outdoor teaching pavilion in the middle of an agricultural demonstration. We're now moving south to Kijonjo. It looks here, and for those of you who are not, who didn't know that, basically in the bottom right corner here, I should have drawn the Lake Victoria as well. Lake Victoria is a corner of Lake Victoria that belongs to Uganda. Kijonjo, in that sense, is very near Lake Victoria, but you don't really experience it. It's still just far enough for it not to really be experienced on the site. The project that we have there is called Our Lady of Victoria Monastery. And I say have because it's still not completed. We have been engaged with this project since 2017, which is kind of a long time, but then it's also kind of a short time if you think that traditionally monasteries used to be built over 3 generations or so. We have been now on site for 3 years. This is what we found when we were called to look at this project. This monastery is belongs to the Cistercian order, which is a Catholic order. They had previously, for the last 30-40 years, actually been in Kenya, and then about 15 years ago, they relocated to this site in southern Uganda, and built in the sort of when was that, about 15 years ago, built this quadrangle of a building, which has the cloister, of course, in the center. And you see there in the bottom left corner a photo taken of it. In the middle there is the chapel. Now, we found this building in an incredibly poor state. The photo, of course, doesn't really show this, but it is a very low-lying site with a very high water table. And the building was incredibly poorly built, and therefore lots of moisture issues, lots of cracks. And then to make matters worse, there had been quite a severe earthquake about 5 years ago. It's in northern Tanzania, which is right next door. And that led to proper structural failure of a part of the building. So what you see there in red really had to be condemned for structural reasons. The rest of the buildings, honestly, we should have also condemned, but we didn't, because the monks really had a certain personal relationship with these buildings. They had really suffered to pull them off. So we felt it would have been very harsh to take them down completely. So we decided to do our best to try and refurbish them structurally. We tried to waterproof the plinth walls. We tried to create proper drainage around these buildings in order to lower the water table and so on. This was one of our very first sketches. Our program was really to build a church, because not only had that the existing chapel developed some serious structural problems, but also the brotherhood is growing. It's doubling in size from 24 months to 48 months. And then in addition, they wanted a novitiate, which is a building where all novices stay before they are actually being admitted to the order and becoming monks. And then they wanted a guest house for visiting monks from other monasteries, or for family members, or for other people who may choose to spend some time in the monastery. Then there was also an important aspect of a gatehouse. We spent a lot of time researching the tradition of Cistercian architecture. They have actually their own very distinct form of architecture. It's 1,000 years old. It's an old tradition that has built up over time, and it couldn't be more different from the typical Catholic architectural tradition. First of all, the monasteries are all designed according to a very, very strict arrangement in terms of which building is where, which direction it faces, etc. And we wanted to really understand that in order to reflect that correctly in the way we arrange our buildings. But then the other thing, maybe more important, is that the monastic church has a very particular spatial configuration. It is an incredibly long and tall space, which has to do with the fact that the monks are actually facing each other in these long rows of chairs that you can see there. So the monks are actually grouped into 2 choirs, and then they sort of talk to each other, they sing to each other back and forth. And there is still an altar on the eastern side of each church, but it is somewhat less important than in a normal, conventional church. This is the site plan that we ended up with. Eventually, you can see there how we are sort of building in front. In a very light yellow, you can see the old building that we had to demolish, and we then decided, for very practical reasons, we decided then to basically extend the old building forward. The practical reason was that we really wanted to wait with the demolition of the existing building as long as we can and keep using it while we're already constructing in front of it. And then we ended up with these very clearly defined 4 additional buildings that create 3 different courtyards. This is a perspective of that. You can see there at the bottom of the picture, you see the gatehouse. The gatehouse in the monastic tradition is really important because it is the one part of a monastery where the monks interact with the community. Monks generally, and Cistercian monks in particular, are very inward. They have sort of an inward and upward philosophy. And in many ways, they are very busy doing their spiritual work, and they're not actually that keen on that much, contact with the surrounding communities. They leave that to the parish priests of the Catholic Church, etc. They have they have outsourced that part of life. And we wanted to express that in our design. We wanted to create quite a, quite a defined envelope within which certain things then can happen. 3 sort of different building heights were created. If you run 3 different datums, you see there in the background the red roof of the existing building, which is sort of our middle datum. Then in the front, the gatehouse and the new accommodation buildings, specifically kept low and humble in their appearance. And then, of course, the church as the centerpiece of the monastery. The idea of using perforated walls came up quite quickly. The idea of, yes, we want to create a very clearly defined skin and a clearly defined sort of perimeter around this monastery, but at the same time we don't really want to completely close it off, and we want to allow air to move freely in and out and without creating these sort of barriers, and that ended up with this idea of these sort of undulating, randomized brickwork and breeze walls. This is the floor plan of the church. You can see they're very long, very narrow, 30 meters by 7 meters. And then obviously the altar on the most eastern end of the church. And then quite quickly we developed this idea of these U-shaped buttresses that leave gaps in between, which are then our windows. The church is directly connected to the chapter room, which is there marked at the top of the screen with number 3. That's very important because the monks really use this church 7 times a day. The church is something very, very sort of, it's part of daily routine. And the actual entrance door on the western wall is practically never really being used apart from during very specific holidays or during certain religious events. I've shown you some images before, but sort of the proportion was really incredibly important to us to make sure that we really achieve this height that was needed to create this spatial effect. But then, of course, it's also interesting that we ended up really choosing a barrel vault. The churches have developed, the monastic churches have developed over the centuries, but the barrel vault was really the one that they began with. And we were kind of fascinated by this. By that space, even though structurally speaking, it's really a very, very inefficient, type of vault, with lots and lots of outward thrust. And you can see there that our buttresses have this inclination. Later on, this drawing is a bit old. Later on, we even inclined the brick to be essentially perpendicular to the force as it moves down into the ground. And then, as sort of the tropical answer to a very Central European space, we have this very lightweight roof that hovers above the church, which really shades and protects the structure from the sun and the rain, but at the same time also collects rainwater, again our primary source of water, and also acts as essentially has photovoltaic panels fixed to it, so acts as our primary source of electricity. This is an early render of the church. The idea being that really there's a subtle inversion of what is structure and what is light. What is we sort of had this idea of creating these columns and arches of light that structure the entire space as you move through it. lots of indirect light, and we achieve that at the high level through inserting bottles into the brickwork, and then at the lower level there are windows that also, of course, allow air to circulate. And then at the very back, behind the altar, this creation of that sort of recess that has light filtering through. This was a picture during construction. Of course, it was or it is, I should say, a major undertaking to build this, especially this church in really in the middle of nowhere, without any big machinery, etc. So it did understandably take the contractor a very long time. I mentioned it, 3 years. We are now on site, and this picture is about 4 months old or so. There you can see they had just started building the barrel vault. This picture is taken from the gatehouse, so the gatehouse actually creates this kind of window towards the church. The way we have built it is by using reinforced brickwork. These bricks are commonly used as vent bricks above windows, and we utilize them as our main, if you want, shuttering material, and then inserted reinforcement steel and self-leveling concrete. As I mentioned, these barrel walls have really a significant outward thrust, and you really need to pick that up. And to make matters more difficult, we are also in an earthquake zone there, in generally on relatively poor ground. You see how the guys constructed this vault using sort of plywood templates, which were then hoisted up in place, and then there's a mix of brickwork and concrete, and reinforced concrete that creates the roof itself. The buttresses I mentioned before, they are inclined. Sort of the coursing is perpendicular to the way the force really moves down, and the buttresses really also express how the force becomes bigger as you come down, as they get wider and deeper. Again, a similar theme as in the Pirigiti project, a ventilated ceiling for all the accommodation spaces. And again, some kind of play with the gutter. Here we did something else. Here we decided that we wanted our entire walkway around these courtyards to be exclusively supported by these breeze walls, because that was sort of our theme of this, if you want, of this layer of slightly transparent brickwork that sort of surrounds these spaces. And we use then the gutter actually as a structural element. It's a purlin that picks up the roof sheet, but at the same time, it is also actually, by being pre-stressed, the gutters are actually, if you want, squeezing down the brickwork and thereby stabilizing these otherwise very, very wobbly walls. And then towards the outside, again, a certain theme that you also have seen in Kamuli already, that theme of the defensive, slightly rugged, textured facade. Here we actually inclined the bottom 1 meter or so. The buildings are generally raised out of the ground quite a bit, but not as much as you see there. The floor level is slightly lower down, and that sort of creates a very subtle confusion between levels from the outside, which is important for the proportion of the facade. These inclined plinths are made using broken tiles with their broken side facing outwards. And we hope that, and we are sure that over time they will weather and will create quite an interesting sort of connection to the ground. Here you can see if you want, the proportion of the facade and how you can't quite tell where the floor level actually is in this building. And then as a second vault, there's a little chapel as well. That's part of the guest house. And here the idea was really to create a walled garden space that is suitable for guests to just retreat and meditate or pray. And it's not really a church. And we use this theme of a barrel vault. Again, this time we used concrete and a rough stone texture the shutter. The pictures are very, very poor because these are taken by phone. They are relatively recent. The guys who had just really started removing the formwork and the props had not yet really cleaned the brickwork, but you get an idea of what's going on there. The floors are ground exposed aggregate concrete, and of course once the construction is over, we basically went once more over it to polish it, but it's wet. It will not be as shiny as what you see there. And then the altar is actually just a boulder that is placed within this elevated area. And there's another photo showing you, looking in the other direction, showing you the guest house chapel. A photo of the church now with a lightweight roof on. This photo was just taken yesterday, so slowly by slowly things are coming together. You can see that the lightweight roof has translucent strips in, and those translucent strips coincide in plan with the arch, the bottle arches, and therefore the vertical sunlight will enter into the church. And then in the foreground is the novitiate, kept sort of quite enclosed, and you can sort of see the novices and the monks sort of shooting past in these walkways, and then the interior of this courtyard will, of course, with time be shaded by trees, and is then going to be useful also as an additional space for prayer and meditation and personal study, etc. We are now moving to the southwesternmost corner of Uganda to Gahinga. It's right at where Uganda meets the Rwanda border. A volcanic region, very high, 2,000 meters above sea level, very cold, very green. The project is called Hingabatra Village. This is really where this project starts. It starts with gorilla conservation. In the 90s, there was a big movement towards protecting the mountain gorillas, and Uganda was quite active in this and created several reserves, nature reserves, that were exclusively created in order to try to protect the mountain gorilla. The one thing that was kind of forgotten in this process and was dealt with quite brutally was that there were actually some humans living in these forests as well, and that group, they are called the Batwa. These are sort of different groups. They are under huge pressure. They have already been under huge pressure for decades. They are spread out all over Central Africa, but in Uganda there are sort of a number of groups that were in these forest areas, and they were basically just being chased away with military might. They were not being given anywhere to live or to stay, and they were essentially uprooted from one day to the next. From being hunters and gatherers in the forest surrounding, they were basically being thrown into a farming community where they were, of course, not particularly welcome. This is a little settlement that I found when I started working on this project. This is a small group of about 118 people at the time, and our client had started engaging with this group already 10 years before. Our client was a luxury safari company that operates lodges in Western Uganda, and therefore really is one of the entities that really benefits from the primate conservation, because that is their primary business. People come to these areas to see the gorillas and the chimps, and volcano safaris, our client, really that was their main business. But in all their lodges, they have a sort of a social responsibility program on the side, and in this particular lodge, their CSR program really consisted of engaging with this small group of Batwa and trying to find more sustainable ways of supporting them. So at the time when I joined, they were living on this tiny little strip, really that rocky bit that you see in the foreground. On either side, to the left and to the right, are farms which are not owned by them, where they basically just worked on sort of on day wages, and the level of destitution was absolutely mind-boggling. And you have to understand that Kisoro is a very cold climate, very, very strong breezes, lots and lots of rain, So you can only imagine, sort of in this totally unprotected arrangement, how poor the situation really was. The client engaged this group for many years in many ways. So, for instance, craft making is a typical example where people are really being given the chance to re-engage with their own history, because they are already in the third generation out of their uprooted, if you want. So actually learning the old crafts was very important, dance, music, etc. The Batois have a very, very rich history. But the client really knew that as long as this issue of, as long as they are homeless and landless and living really on this strip of land, there is really no sustainable way of moving forward. And he actually developed with them a scenario where they ended up buying some land nearby, and the idea was to build a village with them where they can live, where they can start really becoming farmers, where they can start becoming self-sustaining in a certain way. And then an additional idea was also to construct a community center, which they could use for their own activities, but which they could also use as income-generating activities when it comes to tourist activities. This photo is quite interesting because obviously at the lodge, there's always some sort of traditional dance events, etc. So you can see the guys being dressed in their traditional outfits. But what is actually quite interesting about this photo is the building that is behind it. We had actually, when we set out on this project, we had discussed in length what a typical house must look like, and that what would be their typical house. So in the end, we just gave them some very basic materials, and we gave them a piece of land, and we just said, can you just sort of build something that, you know, shows us the size of a house that you are interested in and the shape of the house. This is what they built, and this is what we eventually used as a prototype as we moved on to design and to construct the village. And then we really engaged them. We went to site and we started setting out these houses. We had no drawing whatsoever, and we just gave ourselves certain rules. So, for instance, we said generally we want these houses, we don't want them to be aligned like barracks. We want them to be quite sort of free-flowing, responding to certain terrain issues, responding to trees, responding to rocks, etc. Then the other thing is we wanted them to be quite close together. Because of the wind, we wanted one house to start protecting the other. And of course, we also wanted to still maximize the agricultural use. This is an amazing picture in a way, because all the fellows that you see there are Batois, and so we did have some additional workers that helped us, that had certain qualifications, but still the majority of the work was actually being carried out by the Batois, and this was really an important sign for the local community around this area, because
something I said.
Sorry.
I think someone had their microphone unmuted, so that's fine now.
Okay, sorry. So you know, the surrounding population always felt that the Batois are basically they don't get anything done, and they don't work, and they are lazy, and they are drunkards, and etc. etc. But the truth is that they built this entire village with the most amazing energy, and you can actually see here that they also technically learned a lot. So here this shows that these three guys have learned how to use 3 to 5 in order to create a 90-degree angle for the house. So they actually really set it out themselves. And then we built the simplest of houses that one can imagine, using eucalyptus, using volcanic rock as a base, and then using wattle and daub. It's essentially bamboo and very, very basic earth plaster. And then a metal roof sheet, which was then sort of enhanced by a bit of papyrus, which is a relatively cheap resource in that area. And you can sort of see how this little village sits there. They created a fence around, and then I think this was taken on the day of the opening. Created a nice entrance. And then what we sort of found out as a photographer came with a drone and sort of flew up, it was quite fun. Nobody had planned it, but the fence that they had created was in the shape of a love heart, which was sweet. You can see how the houses are kind of concentrated in one corner of the site, and then Later on, there was more and more agriculture going on, and by now this is really a well-developed piece of land. You can see here also at the bottom corner of the photo, community center. This was our inspiration for the community center. The Batwa used to be hunters and gatherers in the forest, and they had temporary housing. Generally, they always had these temporary little dome-shaped huts, and this was actually just one that they built as a sort of as a demonstration house, so that people can see how the Batwa used to live. And we thought it would be really nice to actually use this shape as our primary typology for the community center. It was not the idea of sort of creating a copy or something like that, but it was the idea of kind of making a statement, mostly to them, that, you know, their tradition is not necessarily completely lost, and you can learn from your own tradition, and you can be proud of it, and you can use it in certain ways. And then the idea of these kind of garage-like openings, of course, in order to make this building as flexible as possible, in order to create additional rain protection, because there is a lot of rain in this area, and then sort of the idea that this building could be used in many different ways, whether it's gatherings, or whether it is craft making, or indeed whether it is little performances, dance performances, etc. You see these little gates from inside, and then a kind of a stage-like backdrop with a bit of a backstage area on either side where dancers can image, and then quite an interesting ornamental sort of design for this dome with a recycled car rim at the very top. We had to get our head around it, the geometry ourselves, and I thought it's quite interesting to share that with you, how we actually did this and how we then later got this to site. And this is sort of a simple model that we did in the office to understand and develop the geometry. But then our real discussion was, how do we now get this built on site with a team of workers who don't really know how to interpret drawings? And we ended up doing some kind of, we called it an Ikea sort of, you know, building instruction, sort of a step-by-step 3D sort of instruction. And I'm just going to go very quickly through it. So it started by setting out a circle, and then additional circles to create the segments, and then a hole in the middle, and then an additional circle, and then some temporary supports in order to be able to fix the inclined first layer. More supports, more inclined columns on either side of the entrance, then further circle with temporary supports, and a further row of diagonals, and then a temporary support, and the final capping. And the funny thing is, this thing, as in they built this thing without one mistake. We were not there when the primary structure was built, because the site is very remote, and we coached them only on photos. And the next time it came, this thing was perfect in terms of its geometry. So it was a very successful way of getting the information across. That's also something that we as architects really need to learn. We need to know who consumes our drawings, and then we need to adjust them. And you see how we did the set out, and then just this is one of these temporary rings of support. And then of course we ended up using flat metal sheets to create the actual waterproofing layer, and then we added papyrus. We're almost done with our circle. So 2 more places. We are now moving back to the north to Mubaku, and that is actually in Murchison Falls National Park, or it is right at the border of Murchison Falls National Park, and right next to the river. This is where we found a place called Nile Safari Lodge. Nile Safari Lodge it was at the time quite a well-known lodge. It's an eco-lodge that had been built 20 years before, and it had seen better days by the time we came. It was really in a state of disrepair. But of course, as you can sort of see on these photos, the most amazing view out over the river, because of the very steep embankment and a beautiful amount of trees and grown vegetation in an otherwise relatively savanna-like surrounding. And then right across from Safari Lodge, the park, so you have fantastic views out towards north. But it was very clear from the beginning that we had to completely rebuild the structure. There was nothing that we could actually retain. The first thing that we normally do on all jobs, but particularly in this case, is we did a very, very detailed tree survey. It's far more detailed than what you see on this drawing. We actually really catalog each tree. We photograph each tree, we name each tree, and we measure each tree in a spreadsheet so that we are really fully aware what is where, and then we try to base our design entirely on a full understanding of these trees. And the idea for this lodge was really to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could construct a lodge that is later not visible on Google Earth? And we try to basically illustrate that when we presented the concept to the client, that we said, we are really going to build into this forest, into these trees. And this was one of the main reasons why we ended up with this idea of A-frames, because A-frames somehow, yes, it was clear that we wanted to use grass thatch. Grass thatch means you go automatically very tall because you need a very strong slope. But then the A-frames, the individual A-frames, was really something that we felt would work well together with the trees. No A-frame would ever be higher than trees, and they would sort of kind of disappear within it. It was also very suitable as a shape because the primary wind direction is north-south. This is generally a very hot climate, and so it made a lot of sense to have these buildings completely open towards north and towards south. And then the idea that you treat the buildings differently, there's the idea of the main building and the idea of the cottages. The main building is really an idea that these A-frame buildings, basically the buildings are actually just roofs. There's no walls, and it's actually open at the lower side. The climate does allow that really. And then, of course, for the accommodation, that is not really practical because you need to be able to really enclose these buildings. But then the idea of putting them on stills and thereby first deal with a very steep terrain, but then also allow the air to circulate freely under the building as well, which also helps in really creating reasonably comfortable indoor climate. And then, of course, the A-frame also has another advantage. It really creates a very nice frame view of the river and of the park on the other side of the river. This is the main building of the lodge, and it's really, I don't really like to even call it a building. It's sort of some kind of I don't know, some kind of growth, and you can really only understand this growth if you look at the trees. The trees are maybe shown a little bit faint on this drawing, but they were actually what generated the arrangement of this book. The trees, and obviously the terrain as well, and then the views, but mostly the trees. And the idea that the building really touches the ground so lightly, and the bush is allowed to actually enter the building, to sort of the boundaries between what is a building and what is the surrounding are kind of messed up. That was an important consideration in this project, and almost as if we have covered footpaths rather than enclosed spaces. And then views out from the main building out into the park as well, or out into the surrounding forests, and sort of quite complex roof shapes that sort of intersect each other. And again, it's really just a consequence of dealing with that particular tree that's there that we wanted to maintain. And then towards the river, where the swimming pool is and where the need for terraces are, then the idea of overlaying that with sweeping shapes of slabs at different levels, in the hope that this would sort of help breaking down the appearance of too much sealed space. The temperatures are really hot up there, and that is one of the reasons why the pool is actually partially shaded, so that it's very hot, you can be in the water and out of the sun. Obviously, the need for, or not the need, but the desire for an infinity pool to really make most of the view over the river from this shaded area. This is the living room, completely open towards the surrounding, the bar area with a straight view through the building. A massage house with an outdoor shower. All rooms actually also have outdoor showers. We quite like to use that as a theme. Here we found a really beautiful dead tree that still had some years to be there, so we decided to punch our shower head through it, and that makes for quite a nice experience showering. And then the rooms are, as I've already explained, they are on stilts, and each room consists effectively out of 2 A-frames. One has the bedroom side, one has the bathroom side, and then in front of the bedroom is either a deck or a stone-clad terrace, depending on the particular building. But again, the idea that even though, of course, these are quite massy sort of buildings, because they are broken down into the 2 A-frames, and because they are responding to trees into which we have built them, hopefully the appearance of a broken down volume that doesn't overpower the surrounding. This is the indoor. You can sort of see that the building is open behind the bed at high level, but even behind the headboard there are vent openings. This is the twin room, and then in the other direction, full-on views over the river. The bathroom has really the same theme, its own little smaller A-frame, fully glazed towards the river, and then sort of a double shower, one indoor, one outdoor, so that people can really choose what they want to use it at the same time. Our last project takes us almost to Kampala. Sentema is really just 20 kilometers west of the capital. And here we were given the opportunity to work on a school project called Masatsi Junior School. And this was a very special project for us because it was our first project where we were not only the designers and supervisors, but where we were actually also the contractor. The client came to us with 4 sites. They had sort of bought them bit by bit, and quite, as you can see, they are quite sort of disjointed. It's a rural setting, but it's a setting that slowly by slowly will be taken up by the city. Kampala has an enormous growth, an enormous appetite for area, so it is really foreseeable that the urban sprawl will move this way. And quite early on, together with the client, we came up with this idea that the 2 sites that are not really joined, that we would use them for distinct purposes. The boulder site, as we call them, we dedicated it to firewood production. We wanted to create a project of sustainable firewood production, which has now started. And the conservation side, the idea was really to do nothing with it, to just protect it and to let it completely wild up this time. And then the main side, these two plots that are sort of just about touching each other, was going to be for our actual school. You can see there how the site sits on the side of a ridge, and whereas the other 2 sides are really down in the valley. So for many reasons, they would have not really been ideal to build on anyways. We started with a very simple functional arrangement, and obviously it's a bit unusual to have a school that has a road through the middle, so we needed to really deal with that in the correct way. And we ended up really deciding that everything west of the road is sort of the actual teaching and classroom space, kindergarten, primary school, admin at the very top of the site, teachers accommodation, whereas then on the lower part of the site we wanted to dedicate it to hostels, with boarding, and then further down sports. This is a very important consideration that guides site plans in such areas, and that is water and wastewater. I'm not going to go into the full detail, but sort of what is where is really determined by very practical considerations. Where do you get your water from? Where do you store your water? From where do you pump it up? In this case, of course, we're collecting rainwater, so it's kind of obvious that the main water collection tank is at the very bottom of the site. But then we also have the idea of a biodigester, which is shown there in brown. So all all toilets are connected to a central biodigester at the bottom of the site. It makes sense to shift that slightly away from the bottom of the site because the output of a biodigester is wonderful fertilizer. So if you have still some space for a school garden, then you really, really benefit from that. And then the kitchen must not really be more than 60 meters away from the biodigester, just in order for the gas to have enough pressure. So there's a certain connectivity of these different considerations that almost designs your master plan, and that is what sort of ended up doing. It has evolved a little bit over time, but broadly speaking, this is still the plan. And you see there is this road in the middle, dividing the two sides, and to the left of it you see this kind of L-shaped building, or this sort of curled-in building. That's our kindergarten and admin area, and then higher up are the primary school blocks. And then this building was broken down into phases, and those are the two buildings that we actually built in phase one, the kindergarten and the first school. Our guiding principle can really just be summarized in these very simple three sketches. We were keen on creating, obviously, like in any project, we were keen on creating comfortable indoor climate. We wanted to achieve that using materials that we excavate on site, and we settled on the idea of earthbag construction. I will show you photos about that in a minute. And then the idea that the walls are actually not really touching the roof. The roof has its own structure, and thereby, of course, wind and generally, wind can pass through freely. Then the idea that once you have separated the roof and the walls, you can actually do with your walls what you want. You're not really tied to a strict grid. And the client had this idea that he really wanted to create a school in which no classroom is like the other. So of course that helped us in this case. And then as a last guiding principle, the idea that we wanted to create pairs of classrooms in order to really maximize on different learning spaces. So you can see here two typical classrooms on either side, but then at the top they share an outdoor classroom. The tiny bubbles in the middle are sort of little reading nooks, and then they also have a little area from where they access the rooms. This is a typical section through the building. You can see that the roof is supported by its own wooden columns. The wooden columns sit on a little pedestal, and then that thick black wall sort of shows you one of these undulating, these curving earthbag walls. And then, of course, between the classrooms, the walls still reach all the way up because we have an issue, of course, of noise transmission. And that also helps us to raise the roof in that direction. This is the primary building. Each classroom sort of follows a similar logic, but then looks quite different. And you can see that each classroom has these 3 double doors that open up onto the external teaching space, which is partially covered by a huge roof overhang and partially shaded by trees. Important here was also to give up on this idea of a covered walkway. Many schools have these very conventional covered walkways. Here we just decided to really not do that. Instead, just rely on the big roof overhang and then create these relatively pronounced recesses from where you enter the classrooms. You've seen that before. Again, on this project, we had learned from Karamoja, and we were happy with our stone foundation, so we utilized that again. We were lucky that there was a stone quarry only about 2 kilometers away from the site, so it was extremely easy to get this material onto the site. And then we built all the curving walls using the earthbag technology. That's of course a technology that sort of originally comes from the military. It's being used for these sort of protective walls in warfare. But then the hippies in the 70s in America used it quite a lot for what they called earthships. And we actually studied a lot how they built, and we learned from them. There are some wonderful books that explain how this technology is being done. And we Ugandanize it slightly, but in principle we followed their ideas. You see how the soil is filled into bags. It's extremely important that you're really standardizing the amount of soil that you fill in there and the amount, the level of compaction. And then it is being compacted by hand. You see that on the right picture, using these sort of steel tempers that we created for it, and it's being compacted whilst it is on the wall. And in between each layer is actually just barbed wire that's been inserted, 2 layers of barbed wire that helps laterally tying these courses together. What is extremely important about this type of technology is that you must at all costs avoid moisture from entering into this material. This is completely non-stabilized. There is no grain of cement or lime in there, and therefore will work extremely well as a proper gravity structure until that moment when moisture enters. And therefore we took that extremely seriously, and you can see here that we have sort of a 3-layered moisture barrier from the bottom. We have got a polythene layer, and then we have a very, very dense C30 concrete slab, and then above it we have a three layers of stone slate, amphibolite stone slate, which is a very dense stone. And so far so good. We are quite confident that these walls are really kept very, very dry. This is sort of a classroom in the making. The walls had just been brought up, and we went ahead building the roofs, of course, as quick as we could, because we really wanted to protect these walls well from rain. And then, of course, the whole process of plastering started. It was our ambition to use only lime earth plaster and sort of natural plasters on the surface, which of course required a great level of experimentation to really learn the best mix and learn the type of application. And here you now see how they fill the first layer, which is commonly called cobbing, sort of basically filling in the little cavities with the very rich soil mix. And then the eventual outcome with a lime stabilized plaster using stone dust. And then in the lower levels, these stone slates. The roof is also not a very conventional roof. The last thing the client wanted was a metal sheet roof. They found it very sort of very industrial looking, but also very dysfunctional in a way. All of you who have studied in the metal roofs know what happens during a rainstorm, and Uganda has a lot of them. And so there's quite commonly an hour of basically doing nothing there and waiting for the drum concert to stop. So here the idea was really to actually introduce a layer of wood above the metal sheet. There's an air gap between the metal sheet and the wood, which allows the wood to dry out regularly after rainstorms. And what we used there were actually the offcuts of eucalyptus trees. They then, with time, this photo was still taken when it was relatively new. With time, they gray out completely. They become sort of silver gray, and the effect that it has on both the temperature and the noise is staggered. What you see here in this picture also is that we left small gaps again. You've seen that before, where there's a translucent sheet below. And then on the inside, we worked with woven ceiling mats, and for these particular strips, we then made mats by weaving in drinking straws, white drinking straws, because of their transparent property, so that with the idea that the texture of the mat can just run through, but of course light can still filter through the ceiling. This is a typical classroom. Before they moved in, they have now moved in, but sadly they are still not allowed to actually operate. But we are hopeful that next week, maybe school. This is the access to the outdoor teaching area, where there are certain curved stone benches. And this is a sort of an overview showing you how the roof with time has already turned silver, and how it sits there quite nicely in its surrounding. Thank you very much.
Right on time, Felix. Thank you so much for the lecture. I must say, for any young designer, seeing this is extremely inspirational. I'd like to, of course, open up the floor to anyone who may have questions or would like to just basically give feedback or generally start a conversation around Felix's work. Or, there's a tab that allows you to sort of raise your hand. I think it should be at the top of the screen. And then I'll let you know when you can speak, or you could also simply just unmute and raise your question. Perhaps I could start a quick conversation about design, because looking at your work, it becomes so distinctive and easy to identify from its material execution and the technologies that you implement. And similar to the project, I think it was in Gahinga, I wonder if as a designer, especially perhaps earlier on in your career, did you ever have the issue, or I guess a sense of pressure to almost try and identify, or I guess what African architecture is in its aesthetic expression, And I ask this because I think that if you do green architecture and you use local materials and local labor, the look of the architecture almost emerges from the materials and the technologies and the limitations that those present themselves. But did you ever think to yourself, how do I make this look like African architecture? Were you afraid that it might not be perceived, or did you try to add that quality to make it look like African architecture? Because I see that you asked them to do like a prototype of what a traditional ideal house looks like. So I just wonder if that's something that you've thought of or battled with as a young designer as well.
I don't think so. I think the Gahinga project is really a bit of an odd one and a special one. Other than that, I don't think I have asked myself that question a lot. You've actually said it. I'm mostly interested in understanding the site, in understanding the materials that are available, in understanding the climate, in understanding the social context, etc. I have not really, I must say, I've not really spent a lot of time thinking about, is this African, is this not African, is this contemporary, or is it not contemporary? I think I'm just not theoretic enough for that, and maybe not academic enough for that. I'm just interested in creating, in coming up with the right answer to the problem. Architects are really, practicing architects are supposed to be problem solvers. We are supposed to create space in which certain things can happen. We are supposed to create sort of, in an ideal world, I would say we are creating inspirational spaces where these things then happen and where good things happen. I will leave it to other people to decide whether this is now more African or European or Asian. No, I love Asian architecture, for instance. I love all sorts of architecture, and I think everything that we do as an architect is sort of it's a mix, really. We have so many influences that what we pick up through our life and people we learn from and things we see, things we read, etc. And then we just kind of keep coming up with new mixtures of the same thing. These are all not new things, isn't it? These are all not, we're not inventing wheels, we're just building buildings. We're just building schools, we're building lodges. These are really the most mundane things. You just need something that inspires you, and I'm sure I don't want to say that one could not be inspired. Why not? One could be inspired by, let's say, traditional Ugandan architecture, or one could be inspired by traditional, I don't know, Cambodian architecture. It's also great, and the climate is very similar. I mean, you could do that, but one doesn't have to.
Great answer. I think we have a question from Miriam Ofona. Please just remember to unmute yourself because you might be muted by default. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, I'm there. Hi. Hi, Martin. Hi, Felix.
Hi.
Yeah. Felix, just for the now Safari Lodge, I was thinking, sorry, I think I came in about 10 or 20 minutes late, but did you work with any local artisans to make the any of the artworks or the lights? I see some kind of not traditional, but lights made from local material. Or did you work with an interior designer who had the same kind of perspective as you, and that's for the Nile Lodge and the Mustard Seed School. You talked about how the sandbags shouldn't, trying to prevent water from getting into those sandbags. Are those bags, I'm not too sure, but are they waterproof? How did you prevent that from happening with the barbed wire in between and to prevent tearing and all that stuff? Yeah.
Good. On Nile Safari, we did not have an interior designer on board. We wanted to have one, but that was sort of taken out of our scope in this particular case. And the client actually is the one who is responsible for the interior design, for the furniture design, for the light designs. They were done by local artisans, and of course we were interacting with them while it happened. But it would not be right to say that we designed them. I do hope that that is something that in the future we can do more often, because of course the most satisfying thing, I would say, if you work on sort of these type of hospitality projects especially, is if you could really do the architecture and the landscape and the interior sort of all and consider it all at the same time, right at concept stage. Because, you know, I don't know whether you've seen that, but if you very often when you ask somebody, you know, how was so-and-so lodge, and you know, a normal person, a non-architect, they will talk to you about the bed and the lights and the desks, and they will never describe the buildings. So in many ways, the interior design is actually more important than the architecture for hospitality. So it's something that I think in the future I would really like to strengthen. Your question about the earthbags. So what I mean here is, you know, there's of course two different cases. One is during construction. During construction, you build these walls and they are totally exposed. And these polypropylene woven bags are not waterproof at all. They are, you know, they are open, especially when they are stretched. So during construction, we actually covered these walls throughout. Whenever it rained, we had big tarpaulins, and whenever it rained, we covered them. Then, of course, eventually the roof is there, and direct rain is no longer an issue. We have stone cladding at the bottom. We have this triple, you know, moisture protection from below, and we have a massive roof. You've seen how big these roof overhangs are. And of course, you should not forget the lime plaster. You know, the lime plaster is a fantastic protection around these walls. And it's plastered on both sides, inside, outside, and on the top. So there's a complete vapor open but protective barrier around them. And I'm told, and this is not something that we've made up, but there's many people who actually remove these polygons and basically cut them off by the time of plastering. So in other words, once the wall is in place and once the compaction has happened, you do not need these bags anymore. They are actually more like temporary shuttering. We didn't do it, but we could have done it. Other people have done it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Nina Maritz.
Felix, before I ask my question, I just want to say I'm absolutely overwhelmed. Your work is fabulous. I'm so jealous. I'm a practitioner, I'm not a student. So I've had some experience with a lot of the things that you've said. Things in Namibia are a bit different technically in terms of the materials and so on. But what I'd like to ask tonight, I mean, I'd love to have a long conversation with you, but what I'd like to ask tonight is the structure of Localworks and how you fund it is very interesting, because we would find it difficult in Namibia to have such a multidisciplinary firm and be able to support it financially. So I'm quite interested in how you managed to do that.
Actually, not that unconventional. Once you sort of accept that we are multidisciplinary, which many companies are, and that we have now started this construction business. But we are generally, I would say, we are actually, commercially speaking or economically speaking, we are a normal commercial practice. We charge fees, and the one outlier is really the Gahinga thing, the Batwa thing that we did as a corporate social responsibility project. But all the other ones we charge fees. Our I would say, I think 60% of our clients are NGOs, and the rest are private investors and commercial people. We do a little bit of sort of institutional government stuff, but not very much. So I would say the majority is NGOs, and we charge design fees. And yes, as in basically because we are multidisciplinary, that means of course everything goes through one door and is then being distributed. We are actually, strictly speaking, even individual companies. Localworks is like a roof, and under that roof we have 5 different companies, and one of which is Studio of H Architects, which is actually what I started out with in 2013, and Studio of H is subcontracting the other, so it's quite complicated in that sense. But for a client it's easy, because a client actually just has a general designer, the architect, and the architect sorts out all the other guys underneath, and it's kind of one point of contact. And then we are providing, I would say, like anybody else, we are providing design services and we're providing construction management services. And then comes in this building aspect, which is really new. We started in 2019. We started this construction side, and Masatsi is our first project that we've really just completed in February. And there it is, we're still learning, I would say. We're learning how to do that best, but in principle also completely separate. This is a separate company. It's a construction company. It's also under this roof, but it works, it sustains itself. It gets contracted by the client, and the client may at the same time have also contracted the designers, but it's a separate contract. And we are actually making sure that, you know, in order to avoid lots of conflicts of interest and such things, we're really making sure that the architect and the engineer and the supervising, you know, landscape architect, etc., they are really supervising this contractor like any other contractor. And we, you know, the contractor creates reports and progress reports, and there are certificates, and there's all this stuff that you would normally also expect in a construction. But in the actual process of building, this system has been an absolute eye-opener for us, because we have really realized that we have only now understood that in this whole normal building process, where you have a client and an architect, or let's say the designers and the contractor, you've actually got one person in there who's got a completely different agenda. Yeah, the client and the architect and the builders, they only want one thing: get this thing done and beautiful and quick and budget and nice quality. The contractor, the contract manager, has got one interest, and that is making money. He's actually creating problems where there are no problems. That's what they are specializing in. They're creating problems. They want to claim. They want to come up with ideas of how they can squeeze out more money out of a project. And we've cut this man out. And suddenly I've realized that you can just work. You talk to the craftsmen, and they have the same interest that you have. They just want to build a beautiful wall as quick as possible without having to build it twice. That's the idea, and I hope, as in, we're just really at the beginning. I'm very inspired by Studio Mumbai. I'm sure many of you know Studio Mumbai, and they have of course done this already for, I don't know, 20 years, and I really admire this sort of direct work, and I hope that we can learn more as we go in that direction.
Well, I'd like to follow your future. I'm definitely a fan.
Okay, thanks for the question, Lina. I think Yamikani, you have your hand up as well. Please just remember to unmute yourself before you start speaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Felix, I am a student at the School of Architecture at NUST, and often when I'm faced with a design brief, I take some time to actually consider the building holistically. So I wanted to find out, when you are at the design stage, do you envision the building and everything inside it all at once, or do you let parts of the building inspire other parts up until it is a solid structure?
If I had to choose, I would say the latter. I think it is more like, it also depends a bit on each project and how the process works. You know, some some flow. I think, as you know, as a student, you will notice some flow very easily, some kind of stutter and don't really move quite smoothly, etc. So it's a bit different, but I would say that my ideal design process is more where it grows, where you know, of course, you start from somewhere, and I think there's no right or wrong there. There's just very many different ways of starting the process. We start always, we are very sort of site-based, site-driven. So we spend time on site, we analyze the site very, 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 very intensely, etc. And then it's sort of, then in our case also the material business comes in, because we are very interested in the material. What is available? What does that mean? You know, earthbags is something completely different to fired bricks. So of course you're going to design something completely different. And then these are sort of what's the ingredients. And then of course there's a bit of intuition and a bit of, you know, sort of a bit of creativity, if you want, needed to put these now together. But I find what is very important is to always highlight. I'm certainly. I think there's only very few geniuses on this planet, and they are there. I think they are there. There are some guys who really sort of just throw 3 lines on a paper and it's there. And that is not how I work at all. How I work is I just work bloody hard. I just work hard and hard and hard. I try and try and try and improve and doubt and question and throw away. And so, and then ideally you watch this thing growing. And ideally, of course, you don't do that alone. Ideally, you do that in a team. Ideally, you do that in a team with people from different angles. You know, let's say a landscape designer and an architect, they have two totally different approaches. But if you're lucky and you find somebody who has overall a similar philosophy, then something very interesting can happen. You don't end up sort of with a sculpture. You know, I'm totally not interested in architecture as objects, in sculptures. It's something that bores me to death. I like buildings that are really more spatial organisms, you know, so spatial things, beings, in which where things happen, spaces that sort of relate and respond to their surrounding and to the people that use it, etc. That is what really interests me. So that is maybe also why I said the latter of your 2 options, because I think the first option, sort of this thing that is being thrown there, I think that is more object design, or that is more sort of, yeah, where you consider the house as one thing. A house is far more than one thing. It has so many different organs, if you want, and each organ can be quite different. So I would say it's a growth process. I had a very good teacher at uni who I learned everything from, and he always said it's, you know, a house grows like a cancer. You basically you just guide it and watch it and mold it, but it just basically it does what it does, and you just need to open yourself up and be very sensitive to it and listen carefully, and then ideally there's something nice.
Thank you, Felix.
Welcome.
Thanks, Yavnikani. I think we have a question from Mary Rose Aki, and then Anna Silva can follow shortly after. And please again remember to unmute yourselves.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, Felix. Thank you for the presentation. Very inspiring and interesting, as usual. I have a question regarding the post-construction, because like the mustard seed and I think the one in Kidapo, where you were doing some relatively not so usual construction methods. And have you yet, I think the mustard seed is the oldest one. Have you yet got, it's not?
It's actually the newest one.
Oh, okay. Have you yet had any feedback from the client or gone back to visit to see the proposed design innovations that you did and whether they're working and possibly how you can improve?
Yeah, so of course we try to stay in touch as good as we can with clients and with previous projects. The one that you mentioned, as in Kidapo, for instance, is basically, we have visited it, we have completed it, I think, 2 years ago, 2019. And then of course came the lockdown. So actually, tragically, the school has never been used. It's unbelievable, but we finished it in February. I think it was used for 1 month in February, and then the lockdown came, and then ever since these buildings have been sitting there, and that's of course not good at all, because when a building sits there, there's also nobody taking care of it, and sort of nature takes over. So luckily, in this particular instance, luckily the contractor still has some certain outstanding snags that they anyway need to address. So we use that as a way of keeping sort of track of the buildings, because of course we get photographic reports. Kidapo is not a place where you just quickly drive to, but we are sort of quite aware of how the buildings do, and we are extremely happy with the earth blocks. Of course, the earth blocks, exposed earth blocks, is of course going to be the biggest worry about this, the structure. The stone is going to go nowhere. The steel is going to go nowhere. It's the earth, the compressed earth walls. Luckily, the contractor did a fantastic job. Our mix was very good. Generally, the soil composition there was very, very suitable to earth construction. So really, they are absolutely going nowhere. They are sitting there happily, and I don't think a concrete block would have done any better than, especially the poor concrete blocks that we have in the local market, and than these blocks. And in Masatsi, I would say that's too young. Masatsi has only been handed over in February this year. So far, so good. We are still in the defect period here. Of course, we are contractors, so now we are still addressing snags and defects. So we are constantly there. We actually still have a team on site. So right now we know every detail of what's going on. I would say the test of time will take longer. The roof, I think, in Masatsi will be the interesting one to monitor. Nile Safari is interesting to monitor as well, because it's the primary structure is wood. Then we've got this issue of the river levels that have risen beyond absolutely any expectation. So now suddenly we have our lowest 2 cottages actually have their front feet in water. That is something they were never designed to do. So that's really not good, and that's something that we are very closely involved in watching. So overall, I would say we're trying. As you know, the pressures of our profession, and we are constantly 3 projects ahead. It's sometimes not so easy to really evaluate your projects properly, but it's something that we are keen on really setting up, that we learn properly from previous projects, and we make sure that making mistakes, when you experiment, you cannot experiment if you're not willing to make mistakes. It's never going to happen. If you want to play it super safe, you cannot go into this experimental type of direction. So you have to somehow be a risk taker. And the client needs to be a risk taker, and we are lucky that the clients already come to us knowing that, and therefore they are risk takers by nature. But then, of course, you really must make sure that you learn from these mistakes, because you can make a mistake, but don't make it twice.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have another question. Anna Silva, I think your hand is up. Please remember to just unmute yourself again before you ask. There we go.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. For the last project, you said that you used eucalyptus trees to protect the roof sheeting. So I wanted to know, how did you protect the eucalyptus trees, since eucalyptus that eucalyptus is a very flammable tree. So how did you protect it against the elements, and also in case of a fire, how do you do so that the fire doesn't spread as quickly, since in natural environment it burns up super quick?
Yeah, I mean we are of course now where this project takes place. That's number one. We are not in an area at all where you might have bushfires or something like that. We are really in the middle of a really tropical, bushy sort of environment. So things like wildfires just don't occur. And so what we now do is what you would always do in order to protect a wooden roof structure. And we have fire detection, and we have extinguishers and such things that we are actually, I would say, we are more worried about what's inside than what's outside. In other words, the roof structure, the ceiling, those are all highly inflammable. I think if the school burns down, I don't think it will burn down because what is on top of it. I think it will burn down because what is below that roof. But God forbid, I mean, that is why we have fire detection systems. And the client is also having actually a plan of actually installing hydrants as well, so that we are really, you know, can fight this fire properly. Because of course here you cannot really rely on, in remote places you cannot rely on the fire brigades.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I see Minette, your hand is up, and then Takudza, you after that.
Hi, Felix. Thank you for your presentation tonight. It was really very informative. I'm currently a 3rd-year student at the architecture school at NUST. As a student, still in a learning process and still finding out what and how materials work and etc. I wanted to ask regarding all of the projects. It's very nature-based. I wanted to ask, what has been your biggest challenge, especially in the design process? What challenges did you face? How did you decide on the type of materials and building materials that you used? Yeah.
I try to sort of show that on some of the projects, maybe not enough, but some of the time frames, of course, also a bit limited, but somehow when it comes to which material is best used for which project, the first approach would be what is there on site. So you saw that in Kidapo we found this stone, and the stone is just magic, and we found some buildings that had used it, but really not many. We just loved the color of it and the texture. So that was kind of clear, and then of course, you know, in Kidapo, there's no real city around there. There's no production of materials at all. So using earth construction was almost a must, because the budget was very limited. And so then when it came to Kamuli, we were quite inspired. There was actually a brickworks nearby, and so then there was this, you know, the client from an agricultural background, from even a coffee producing background, and then the idea that the client wanted a zero maintenance building. Now brick behaves incredibly well in this climate. I don't know about Namibia, but here it's like brick is the one material that just doesn't seem to age. We have a lot of mud, we have a lot of dust, and brick just always looks like on day one. So it seemed to be perfect. Ironically, we ended up not using the brick from that brickworks because there were problems, and we ended up having to use brick from further afield. But still, at that time, the design, of course, the design intent came from there. So in a way, I would say the first inspiration would be what's there on the site. But then there are other things I try to express at the beginning that, you know, it's not about being now super fundamentalist. It's not about black or white or right or wrong. And I would say that this whole idea of, you know, contextual architecture or sustainable architecture, I think should be a case-by-case thing, and you need to weigh up so many different things. And I think common sense should probably be is probably the #1 thing that you apply in any one case, and then you mix in a bit of creativity.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and then I think the last question we'll take is from Takudza. Your hand is up. Please remember to unmute yourself as well.
Hi, Felix. Thank you for the presentation. My question is very similar to Minette's, but what I just wanted to find out, as I'm a 2nd-year student at NUST, in terms of materiality, like maybe the way I can phrase the question is, how has your transition be from I mean, being maybe a student of architecture to actually now working in the industry and stuff? Because I find that when we are designing for our projects and stuff, materiality is a very tough thing to figure out. You know, thinking about what's around, what can I use, how will I use it, especially in the detailing and so forth. So like, I just want to find out in terms of you, like, how did you come from a place of maybe learning in school and what you were doing there in terms of materiality to what you actually do now, where you use what's around you or what's on the site?
So I studied in Germany, and then I moved to Uganda directly after finishing university, and I joined a firm here in Kampala, and I worked for them for 8 years. And everything that I learned about, I would say, about architecture, not about materials, about architecture, and about building, I learned in those 8 years. And I always tell any student who asks me, I tell them, do not make that mistake of thinking that you are that one genius, and therefore do not set up your business straight out of university. Try your best to find an employment where you can work under an experienced architect and you learn this trade. You know, you just described how difficult it is to sort of understand how to work with materials and how to prepare, but that is really just one of the very many difficult things in our profession. This profession, you know, as simple as it is, designing and building houses, as complex is it at the same time. And I would not underestimate the complexity of this profession without now wanting to scare you away. It's a fantastic thing that it's complex because it will never get boring as well. But there's only so much that you can learn in uni, and then there's lots of stuff that you have to learn when you're practicing. And in my opinion, the best way of learning that is when you are working under or with an experienced architect. And then with time, of course, with time you get more experience and you learn, and then you can set out doing other things. I must say also that this thing of materials is really just one thing. I think there's so many other things that you can base your interest on and that you can sort of focus your work on. I also don't think that I want to now for the rest of my life only experiment with materials. I see that sort of a bit of as a phase in a way. There's so much more things that you can learn and explore in architecture and beyond just the experimentation with interesting materials. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think, yeah, I don't see any more hands up. And maybe that's a good thing since I see that it's about 8 p.m. In Kampala right now, so we're probably eating a bit into your dinner time. In general, I'd like to first say thank you to Felix Holland for taking time out of your schedule to provide what's been a really, really good lecture. I think a lot of the students will be speaking about it for a long time, as usually happens when we see a very good, inspiring lecture. And I think everyone who's missed it as well will have a chance to see it since the lecture has been recorded. I'd also like to thank everyone who's made time to see a lecture, not just colleagues and students in Namibia, but others from South Africa and Uganda as well. It's extremely nice to have such a diverse group coming together to speak about architecture, especially when it's very inspirational and good architecture. So yes, I'd like to say good night to everyone. Thank you for coming. If you've been a part of this lecture, you will most probably be receiving further invites for additional lectures that we'll have throughout the year. Always trying to attract more good speakers. And Felix, if you're ever back in Namibia, please do take a chance to pass by the department and say hi. It would be great to. Yeah, it'd be great to have you around and, so that everyone can meet you. Right, with that, thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thanks a lot for the invite.
Thank you. Good night.